Hi friends and neighbors, my name's Host Eric and I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. And additionally, a fellow who enjoys a good hearty musing now and again. Which is what I'm doing right now, I'm musing. What am I musing about, you may wonder? Well, it's a continuation to some extent of the previous video I put up called The Frame Block Crisis, which talked about basically frustrations I experience in life because of my priorities and where they conflict with others' priorities, and more importantly, the thought that the value of something is very much contingent on people, on a given person or group or agent of some sort, of their willingness to extend themselves far enough to discover the value therein. Certain things, it's very easy to see the value of them, and generally it's because those things are highly refined, zero-sum competition kind of activities. You're going to be hard-pressed to be an outlier in athletics, be able to jump substantially higher than all of your classmates or whatever, without that getting noticed and refined, possibly celebrated, etc. And the reason is because of the wonderful benefits of zero-sum competition. Unlike most things in life, with zero-sum competition, you get to definitively know, without an explanation, although there is an explanation, you get to definitively know and be right. So, I know that the Lakers won the game if they scored more points than the other team. And on some level, I know that I can win the argument that the Dodgers last year were the best team in baseball because they won the World Series. So normally, knowledge things like that, holistic knowledge things like quality of something, there may be correct and incorrect answers to it, but you can't win the argument. And technically, you can't win the argument that the Dodgers were the best team in baseball last year. You can simply win the argument that they can more successfully make that claim than any other team because they won the World Series. Now, there are plenty of other talents in life that might get recognized and even potentially get rewarded. Efficacy in general tends to be rewarded. So if you can get from point A to point B successfully, then people who want to get to point B will find you useful, and you'll have a value to others predicated on your utility to them, right? But that's the thing about valuing predicated on utility, is that it means that for certain kinds of things, certain kinds of talents or abilities, they're not likely to get treated very meritocratically, and it's because they're potentially, some of them is because they're knowing type things, but unlike zero-sum competition, there is no definitive criteria that we can agree upon as to who won the battle of the bands, for example, in the way that there is with basketball or baseball. And even more challenging, when you deal with something like art, you can't even look to skills as being informative at all. So I might not be able to objectively say which basketball team is better before they play each other. Nevertheless, I could watch the players warming up and note that some of them had more skills than others. Some of them could make almost all their baskets, whereas others only made some of them. And I can conclude that, wow, that player must be really good. His skills are really good. And there's a very strong correlation in that context between skills and quality. Of course, it's not 100%, because you could have somebody who's very skilled but a super big ball hog and ultimately ends up not being so much of an asset as a deficit. You kind of think of Kobe Bryant like that, you know? He always wanted the ball when it mattered, but he wasn't any better than anybody else at shooting it in. People think of him as clutch, but he was kind of the opposite of clutch. Regardless, I don't want to get sidetracked into a Kobe Bryant conversation. Regardless, with something like basketball, you have a very close connection between skills and quality. But you don't have that with art. So you can have 10 different people try to demonstrate something challenging to play on the guitar that they know how to play. And it's very possible, maybe even more likely, that the person who plays their instrument most poorly is the best artist. If you look at some group like Violent Femmes, the guy who was the main guy in Violent Femmes, he was not even hardly a musician at all, barely played an instrument. I think he plays guitar, but what he did have was a vision and some excellent songs. He met these two actually good musicians, a drummer and a bassist, who were good enough artists to understand that they weren't artists, that they needed a visionary to drive the expression of the medium that they were working in. So accordingly, we have varying degrees of ability to know definitively, even though knowledge is not the same thing as understanding, and therefore is on some level always going to be indefensible. I cannot defend the reality that before I left the house, I picked up trash and rearranged musical instruments and stuff. If I were called upon to defend it, I might be able to, because of my unique circumstances. I could say, well, look at this video from the other day and you can see what it looks like in the background here and how it's changed here. But even then you can say, well, there's not proof that you did it, Eric. Because in that instance, I'd be using my subjective knowledge. And so it's important to remember that contrary to what people think of the difference between knowing and believing something, knowing is something that happens instantaneous, that you believe, that you rely upon as true for sure, because there's no reason not to. Either it's obvious or it's your experience, but that is not defensible. Interestingly, there's this famous quote famous notion that knowing is justified true belief. Well, that's what happens when you start at entirely the wrong place and treat knowing as though it was an object of analysis independent of anybody doing it, right? The reality about knowing is not that it's justified true belief. It's that it's your intuition or your experience, and therefore it's never justified. It may be true or it may not. You're probably almost always going to believe it's true regardless. So Trump doesn't have any deliberative understanding capacity because he's FI tool. But what he does have is 4-slot weak NI, introverted intuition. He knows what he's saying is true because he intuits as such. And he doesn't get the fact that there are certain kinds of things that you can know are true via intuition and other kinds of things that you need to know about via understanding. In other words, you don't need to know them, you need to decide or determine them. But since an ESFP's only way of determining something, and Trump's an ESFP, is to use use their true function, which is their own subjective feelings. And even an ESFP has some inkling that their own subjective feelings are probably not a great guide for public policy. You know, that there's some need to appeal to an external standard, but accordingly he just is going to use his own introverted intuition, which is knowledge about the external, the developed form of proto-intuition, which is shape constancy. Even though I'm seeing this from this direction and this direction, it's actually the same thing. So introverted intuition then is knowing about the identity of things outside of oneself that one can know about rather than determine. Accordingly, you're going to encounter in Trump somebody who knows a great deal and may have some true beliefs, but has no justifications whatsoever, because the functions of justification are functions of are predicated on a value of fairness and or of equal opportunity to be a member of a group. TIFE shit, you know. I kind of lost my train of thought. Hold on. So let's segue away from that to where I'm going with this topic, why I'm making this video in the first place. I was reading Google News a little while ago before I left the house, and I've been reading recently a lot of such articles about how one headline said, scientists have found half of the missing matter and energy. If you're familiar with dark energy and dark matter, it's this. Well, we'll get to what it is in a second. So, this whole point about dark energy and dark matter, it really is informative about different things that language can do and should be allowed to do when it's appropriately directed. So, for example, dark matter, dark energy, scientists, meaning astrophysicists specifically, have plenty of math that they use to successfully predict orbits and shit like that within a certain margin of error. They've got these very long distance investigative tools that they use to make determinations about things. So you may not be able to see hardly anything through even the powerful telescope with a teeny little blip, but if they can detect wobbles in its orbit, they can deduce from that there's some third planet nearby or something, right? Shit like that. Anyway, the conventional contemporary cosmological explanation for the universe existence and everything is fixated on the idea that matter and energy are moving outward from a central origin spot. That's the idea of the Big Bang, right? But what happened some years back is they kept doing all these tests to validate what their explanations were and their maths were, and they kept coming up way short in terms of the amount of matter and energy they expected to find in the universe. So instead of saying, okay, maybe our predictions were wrong, or maybe our current model is missing something substantial mechanically in some way, they just said, well, the mechanics of our model must be correct. So that means that there is shit tons more matter in the universe than we see. It's just dark, so we don't see it. And there is shit tons more energy in the universe than we see. It's just invisible. Dark, we don't see it. And we have no way of finding it or measuring it. Just some hypotheses about if there were such a thing, how, if we were to test something like that with this potential test that we might be able to do some point in the future, that could be either consistent or inconsistent with the idea of a bunch of invisible shit. Well, of course, I said a long time ago when they first started talking about this shit, this is complete bullshit. That's not how you do science, for God's sake. You just don't make up invisible shit so that your maths work out. I mean, like, I take an elementary school math test, right? 2 plus 7, I write down 14. She says, but 2 oranges and 7 oranges is 9, Eric. I said, yeah, but you didn't write down that there were an additional 5 oranges that are invisible. I counted those oranges. She would say, well, there's no reason to think those oranges exist. I made no mention of them anywhere. Well, by my math, 2 and 7 is 14. Ergo, there are invisible oranges. That's basically all the astrophysicists did. It's a complete garbage science, right? And yet, because of this weird obsession people have with avoiding ambiguity or uncertainty or not knowing things, that both people who read things in the media, watch things in the media, make things in the media, or the scientists themselves, they are always announcing things as though they have been determined when they are not even remotely determined yet. Not that nothing ever is determined, but for example, I was reading another article today that said, oh, turns out high cholesterol actually isn't bad for you. Will you stop putting out your speculative notions before they've been vetted at all? We've had decades of this shit. It used to be the case that everybody thought that if you smoke cigarettes, you're eventually going to get lung cancer because cigarettes cause lung cancer. Well, they do make you substantially more likely to get it, but only if you already have the genetic marker that predisposes you to lung cancer. Otherwise, you're never going to get it. And it took me such a long time of researching to figure out what the actual percentage of people who smoke get lung cancer is. And I've read, they don't want, I don't know who they is, but because people have an agenda in studying these things, they position the data in a way that makes it sound as bad as possible. So one thing you'll hear a lot about cigarettes and lung cancer is that it increases your likelihood of getting lung cancer by 15 times. Well, that's true. And it's still, even among lifetime long smokers, from all the research I can tell, it's about 1 in 300 get lung cancer, which is, 15 times more likely than somebody who never smoked. Because if you have that predisposition to lung cancer, you have a somewhat decent chance of not getting it anyway, provided you don't put carcinogens into your lungs. However, if you have that marker, then you might get it even without ever smoking. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if it's a majority, but there's a very substantial percentage of lung cancer patients are not smokers. Of course, if they ever even had one cigarette in their lifetime, it's written down as smoking caused cancer or something. So this is the thing. What I'm getting at here is people need to accept the fact that we have to withhold judgment on shit. We have to be okay with ambiguity. When we don't know the answer, the correct answer is we don't know. I mean, people should have thought a long time ago, hold on a second. Everybody's saying these cigarettes are so bad for you, going to kill you, everything. I've been smoking them every day for decades. How bad could they possibly be, really? I mean, maybe they'll take some years off your life, or maybe they won't, but what we can definitely determine is it's not bad for you, like, say, eating plutonium. If you smoked a little bit of plutonium every day, it would last about 5 seconds. It's not bad for you, like, I don't know, cyanide. Well, no, it's not like that. It's bad for you, like obesity. Okay, well, yes, it's true that people who are heavier are less well suited for long life because carrying around extra weight makes your heart work harder and your body work harder in general to do all the biologics it needs to. But again, we're talking about something that's very much like smoking. It's only bad for you if you were born for it to be bad for you. So if you were born prone to obesity, then yeah, weight is probably going to be a health issue for you at some point. Does that mean that you should tell other people, hey everybody, listen, don't eat or you're going to get too fat like me? No. Just because fat people, when they eat a shit ton of food, get too fat and have health problems, doesn't mean that people like me, when they eat a shit ton of food, get too fat and have health problems, because I have a very high metabolism. Same thing with smoking. But instead of being sane and reasonable and rational, society loves to get all, it just loves that safety fear, you know? We've got all these public service announcements that are filling people's heads with lies. Why? Because whoever's in charge of putting those things out doesn't care about the means. So convinced are they that their ends are desirable enough that they don't need to worry about how they accomplish anything. Of course, they're idiots, so they don't anticipate the many horrible unintended consequences of lying when you're in a position of authority like that. So I emerged from my schooling years refusing to believe anything was bad about any drugs, basically, because it was so obviously lies that I was being told. I remember a cop came to talk to our middle school class and said that if you took LSD, it would turn your brains into scrambled eggs and you wouldn't be able to think anymore, etc., all this other garbage. Of course, that's not true. I remember being taught in no uncertain terms that one of the reasons why marijuana is so bad is that it makes it so you don't puke. And so then if you drink alcohol and marijuana together, you get alcohol poisoning because your body won't throw up the alcohol. Well, that's completely fucking garbage. Obviously, anybody who's been drunk and then smoked pot knows that that's garbage because you get the spins and hurl like first thing. So, you know, how does all of this stuff link to the topic of what I'm talking about here? Well, it comes together in the following way. There are two big problems, I think, in the world from my perspective, and that's from the perspective of somebody who's a deliberator talker, right? The two big problems are, number one, a desire to, and a general belief as a heuristic in doing something is better than doing nothing, which is complete fucking garbage because of all the unintended consequences. Unintended, unforeseen, nevertheless horrible. You know, it's like these people who back in the day were participating in DARE and trying to keep kids off drugs, they all believed they were doing good work, no doubt. They thought, oh, we're wonderful people, we're saving kids from drugs. Instead, who knows how many suicides they caused, right? By telling people who were doing intoxicants, you're a loser, you're worthless, you're shit, you know? Why are you even alive? Well, I mean, I know I had a friend who partied with me. I'm not saying those lies were the culprit entirely or anything, but you know, life didn't go so great for him, and he ended up self-deleting in his early 30s. His dad was a sheriff. One has to wonder if instead of having people come into the schools and tell the kids that people who are on drugs are worthless losers, if people go into schools and say everybody deserves your respect, only critique people for wrongdoings committed by them against others or for wrong words spoken by them ill-advisedly. those are fair things to critique. Behaviors and words that affect other people. It's not fair to critique me for rolling over a lot in my sleep, because the only person who can conceivably critique me for that would be Rachel, and even then, it would not be fair for her to critique me for that, because that's just who and how I am. It's not something that is a moral issue, because it's not a violation of anybody else's rights, and it might be a practical issue if my tossing and turning kept Rachel awake, but we have a practical solution that is, say, more than one bedroom. So, pause. So, as I said, number one big problem, the false belief that we've got to do something, when generally speaking, for most kinds of problems, it's best that the group do nothing. Inherency is a real stickler, you know. Whether the problem you're attempting to solve with your legislation it has inherency is not an easy question to answer usually. To definitively answer that yes, we should do your plan, we have to definitively ascertain that the problem has inherency, which is to say that it won't solve itself, and that the plan actually addresses a significant barrier in the status quo to solvency in a way that will affect real change, right? But the second civilization destroying buttfuckery that is killing us all in some sense is the insistence on knowing things. Just accept the fact that there are lots of questions to which we don't know the answer. It's not for lack of trying to answer it, but it may be because it's unanswerable, as in the question of the morality of abortion, since it can't be calculated on a rights calculus, and that's the only kind of normative calculus that's actually normative. There's no way to determine the moral status of abortion. We just have to go with our intuition. We have to know about it, right? We know abortion a day before giving birth is wrong. And most of us also know that Plan B, taking a pill after you had cum inside of you, is not abortion, not morally wrong. Most of us can agree with those ends of the spectrum, right? Because we have to use our intuition to know. We could use our experience. We've had an abortion and found it very traumatic. We use that experience to know and then project that onto others. But the thing is, nobody will ever win that argument as to whether it's immoral to restrict abortion or immoral to allow it. Nobody will ever win the argument, because the only correct way to determine a moral status, such as permissible, impermissible, obligatory, is via a calculus that doesn't try to tell you whether something's moral or not based on the outcomes, but rather, before an action is taken, can render a verdict: if you do take this action, you will be wicked, or you will not. Otherwise, there's no point in even having a normative framework. If it doesn't tell you whether you did something wrong until after you measure the impacts, it's like, oops, I anticipated wrong again. I killed everybody. You know, it's like, I thought it was moral for me to commit genocide because the country would be better off without those people. That's utilitarianism in a nutshell. And unfortunately, it is a cancer upon the world. Under no circumstances should anybody accept that anything should be done despite the fact that it's illegitimate because you expect good outcomes. You know, it's like the COVID shit, right? It caused massive harms that are easily calculated. They're actual literal harms that are calculable. It attained no equivalently measurable positive outcomes, because, you know, you still read things like Nobody doubts that the COVID vaccine saved millions of lives. Well, of course it didn't, because it didn't prevent you from getting COVID. And even if the current claim, which is it makes you slightly less likely to die of it under some circumstances, even if that's true, the vast majority of people wouldn't have died from COVID anyway. It had a 0.4% fatality rate. So, there's this desperate need to know that your experience validates. I remember I was there COVID and I was panicking and alarmed and insistent that everybody stay home and wear masks and do all this other shit. And thank God I did that, because it saved so many lives. Except it didn't. You're lying to yourself. And it did cost many, many, many lives. Mental health problems, suicides. People like my dad got forcibly separated from his wife of 50 plus years and not allowed to visit her until he got vaccinated by a vaccine that wouldn't be ready for another 6 months. I mean, this is the thing that happens when you don't do epistemology correctly, when you try to know things that should be determined, when you try to do things before you understand them or talk about them. If you want to just ignore legitimacy, then we'll just have an endless sequence of just civilization destroying herd idiocy, you know? Which brings me to, at long last, my thesis. I don't know if it's the thesis or the conclusion, but the bottom line is this. Somehow, some way, one way or another, the only thing that's going to save humanity and civilization is if people start to find correctness emotionally engaging and satisfying. Because what the world most needs is to understand correctly, so that idiots don't do idiotic things in the absence of understanding. The world does not need to know, it needs to understand. We as individuals need to know, and there's nothing wrong with us trusting our intuition, trusting our experience to know things. But in the public sphere, it's time to allow some legitimacy, credit, value to the only thing that will save us, being corrected. I would pose to you here today that that's our challenge, my challenge, and if you care about talking with famous people, it's your challenge as well. I get that I'm not necessarily the most likable guy, maybe I'm abrasive sometimes, condescending, or whatever else. I also get that other people think that what I'm doing, explaining things, talking about things, etc., that everybody can do that equally well and with equal validity. That's absolutely not the case. But it is the case that almost nobody wants to be corrected, especially adults. At least when you're working with kids, when you're a school teacher or something, they aren't married stubbornly to their existing set of narratives, right? They expect the teacher to know more about them. And that's understandable. I also expect teachers to know more than me about things if I'm going to them for instruction. But the problem with what I'm doing, which is correctly describing the world, the universe, human consciousness, correctly explaining political things, correctly articulating how discourse should be done if we want to avoid this culture wars, self-cannibalism shit that's going on, etc. People don't think that that's something that is understood. They think that it's something that's known, and accordingly they think, well, their knowledge is as good as my knowledge, is as good as anybody else's knowledge, which is to say it's indefensible but certain. Except that's not the case with me at all, because I am not knowing this. I've thought about things a shit ton before I ever get around to talking about it. I have understood them before I begin explaining them. And when people give me pushback about shit, especially about cognitive functions, it's just like, I refuse to argue with you because you're so in the wrong county. I will have to go all the way. We don't even mean the same thing when we use the same words, right? I get a little frustrated with, I used to get a lot more frustrated with evolution, because it seems like people are kind of coming around a little bit on that question. Certainly, I think anybody who's capable of listening to what I'm saying critically, right, which is to say, to determine it on its merits, whether it makes sense or not. Well, if they're able to listen to me critically, then at the very least, they no longer feel certain that they have an answer as a speciation. But what people really need to hear, understand, listen, is not anything so concrete as that. It's philosophy stuff, right? Like, people want to come argue with me about I say, okay, well, here's a description of reality. People use this word to mean this. They use it in this way to mean that. They use it in this way to mean that. And here's the distinction between these meanings. I'm using it to mean yeah, in coordination with this. If you want it to mean something else, then you provide an operationalized definition, and we can use yours as fine. People hate that, right? Because if I'm telling them, no, you're wrong, TI is an objective function. Forget what Jung said, it's objective. Well, Jung says it's subjective. Well, what did you mean by the word subjective? What do you mean by the word subjective? Of course, they don't know what they mean by it. They don't know what distinction they're trying to draw. So, objectivity or subjectivity is used in a few different ways. This is why I brought this up as an example of something where I can explain something and it won't matter at all. Like, look, Jung said TI is subjective. As long as you and I can agree on an operationalized definition, we can come to agreement. Objectivity, in my definition, represents a disinterested calculus, whereas subjectivity represents an interested calculus. And we can easily distinguish between what examples of what those are. Like a referee has a purportedly disinterested calculus, whereas a fan at a sporting game has an interested calculus. They're always going to think the ref made the wrong call against their team, but the ref is going to try their best to be fair to both teams and call the game accurately, to be correct. So we do all have sufficient knowledge from experience to recognize the fact that there are disinterested and interested calculi, that they are different things, and that a interested or disinterested calculus is appropriate for a given thing depending on its specifics, right? It's absolutely appropriate for me to use an interested calculus to decide where to go to vacation, because I'm the one who's going to be there and have to enjoy it, right? It's not appropriate for me to use an interested calculus to determine what's best for my neighbors. Why did you knock down our house? Well, I was blocking my view. Well, are you going to pay us for it? No, that wouldn't be in my interest. So, pause. So, I'm a good person. I worry about the world. And I actually believe, you may call this insane arrogance or whatever, I actually believe that most of the problems in the world could easily enough be resolved if people would just listen to me. In other words, if people would understand before either taking action or drawing conclusions, So, if you watch this video, you made it all the way to the end. First of all, wow, you're a beast. Second of all, that means you're capable of figuring out how to get other people to like being corrected. If we could just do that, it would be golden.